Preconscious. So this is another definition of the three levels of mental life. Conscious is defined as those mental awareness at any given point. It is the sensory awareness of the environment and the continuing sense of self in the world. It can also mean waking state of a person. Next is preconscious. Level of the mind contains all those elements that are not conscious but become conscious. In psychodynamic theory, a descriptive material that is not in awareness but can be brought into awareness by focusing one's attention. Unconscious contains all the drives, urges, or instincts that are beyond our awareness. In psychodynamic theory, it is descriptive of ideas and feelings that are not available to our awareness, also without awareness. So I have already discussed this one from the previous slide. So next. So in this illustration, this is the another point of view ni Papa Freud for us to elaborate the structure of the mind wherein the conscious levels is indicates here the thoughts and perceptions. Subconscious level or the preconscious level naman is the memories, stored knowledge, and the last one is ang unconscious level. Here na belong si fears, violent motives, unacceptable sex desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences, and selfish needs. Next is the provinces of the mind. So if there's an existence of levels of mental life, so dili pod magpaiwit si provinces of the mind just with id, ego, and superego. So during 1920s, Freud introduced a three-part structural model that help him explain mental images according sa iyahang functions o purposes. The tree has no territorial existence, means dili man ni nato sila makita into physical body nato, merely hypothetical constructs. Id, a term derived from the important pronoun meaning, the it, or not yet owned component of personality. So why stated here na not yet owned components of personality? It is because, di ba, it operates pleasure principle. So pleasure seeker si id. So ginaambisyon pa niya na maiya jud og dili mailog sa lain. So it means na there are those dreams, desires, or mga pinakagusto nato. Si id want to satisfy his or her. So si id want to satisfy So sinasabi na not yet own component of personality si id, it's because just to satisfy our basic desires. So no contact with the reality, yet it strives constantly to reduce tension by satisfying basic desires because its sole function is to seek pleasure. It operates on the pleasure principle. Si ego naman, the ego or I, the only region of the mind in contact with reality. It works out in realistic ways of satisfying the id's demands, often compromising or postponing satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society, wherein nagabase siya sa reality. Siya ang may direct contact with the external world, tries to substitute for the pleasure principle of the id. So if si ego fails to use the reality principle, this is the time na we fail to commit the demand sa ego, then dito papasok si anxiety as third party. Kakabit dito si anxiety. Magpapapansin siya diriya. So in order to reduce that unpleasant feeling of anxiety, ipagtatanggal tayo dito ni unconscious defense mechanism. So, in order to reduce the unpleasant feeling of anxiety, dito lang yan lahat sa ego. So, here in the ego. As the sole region of the mind in contact with the external world, with the ego becomes the decision making of personality. If the ego fails to use the reality principle, anxiety is experienced and unconscious defense mechanisms are employed to help ward off the unpleasant feeling is superego. In Freudian psychology, the superego or above I represents the moral and ideal aspects. It incorporates the values and morals of society. The superego's function is to control the id's impulses. It persuades the ego to choose moralistic goals and to strive for perfection rather than simply realistic ones. Voice of conscience that focuses on how we ought to behave. So here naman kay superego, moralist and idealist principle naman siya, which focus syempre sa moral and value. So as what we have just read na to strive for perfection rather than simply realistic ones. So dili siya ka ego no kay realistic man to si ego. Dapat perfect jud like same sa inyong relationship diha. Perfect kaayo, feeling nimo na wala na joy makabulag pa. Char lang. So si super ego is gusto jud niya according to our values and moral standard. So by the way, in superego, responsible siya for the dictating which is good or bad. Unlike kang id na as long as masatisfy lang ang iyahang basic desires. So naga-base jud siya again sa values and morals principle. And then like for example, kini since hapit naman jud ang Valentine's Day, so you have been lying to your girlfriend or boyfriend baron several times. And then here comes nga hapit na Valentine's Day, nakonsensya na ka kay feeling nimo bitaw na guilty kayo ka kay Valentine's, hapit na Valentine's, and then sige ra kag pangatik sa iya ha. Kay reason out nimo kay mag-study ka maong wala kay time sa iya ha, pero ang truth jud kay sige ra kag ML. So you've decided to buy her a gifts. So you've decided to buy her a gifts. Char, sana all again kay para makabawi ka. So here ginadiktahan ang imuhang values, di ba? Na-identify nimo which kung unsa ang tama sa mali. So that's it. The next one, so this is the another illustration to sum up sa provinces of the mind. So, si id, a pleasure-seeking person dominated by the id. A guilt-ridden or inferior feeling person is driven by the superego. A psychology-healthy person dominated by a guilt-ridden or inferior feeling person is driven by the superego, while a psychology-healthy person dominated by the ego. So, ito na yung illustration ni id, ego, and superego. So, sinasabi ni id, I want it now. So, yun yung dream niya, desires. Yun kanina. So, si ego naman, I need to do a bit of planning to get it. So, more on realistic si ego. Then, si superego naman, you can't have it, it's not right. So, nakabase sa moral and value standard. So, I hope you learn about the provinces of the mind. Another illustration na pod, the adventures of id, ego, superego. So si id, instincts, ego, reality, superego, morality. So as what sa nakita nyo sa illustration, so si id is medyo na sungayan, pero it depends on the situation man. Then si ego, reality, superego is medyo anghel. So that's it. The next slide is the dynamics of personality. So levels of mental life and provinces of the mind. So levels of mental life and provinces of the mind refer to the structure or composition of personality, but personality also do something. Thus, Freud postulated a dynamic or motivational principle to explain the driving forces behind people's action. Behind people's action. To Freud, people are motivated to seek pleasure and to reduce tension and anxiety. So the next one is drives. Freud used German word drive to refer a drive or a stimulus within a person. His official translators rendered as instinct, but more accurately the word should be drive or stimulus. So drive, no, kung in illiteral natin, ano yung nagtutulak sa atin to do the action, drive or stimulus. So according to the drive theory of motivation, people are motivated to take action in order to reduce the internal tension that is caused by unmet needs. Various drive can be all grouped under two major headings: sex or eros, and the second is thanatos or destruction and aggression. So to understand these two, let's proceed to the next slide. So drives, eros, the life instinct, thanatos, the death instinct. So under kay eros, the procreation, social cooperation, survival. Diba, if we can still remember about eros and thanatos, known ni sila in Greek mythology, kung saan si eros doon denotes romantic or intimate love, god of love, desire, and sex. While si thanatos naman, in contrast, he was the demon personification of death. So, if sa psychology naman, so here eros, the life instinct, procreation, social cooperation, survival, under na kay eros. While si thanatos, the death instinct, aggression, risky behavior, and relieving trauma. So that's it. Next. These drives originates in the id, but they come under the control of the conscious or ego. Each drive has its own form of psychic energy. What is this psychic energy? So Freud used the word libido for the sexual drive. Libido is the psychic energy for the sex drive. So next is sex. The aim of sexual drive is pleasure, but this pleasure is not limited to genetical satisfaction. Freud believed that the entire body is invested with libido or psychic energy. Besides, the genitals, mouth, anus are specially capable of producing sexual pleasure and are called as erogenous zone. To Freud, however, all pleasurable activity is traceable to the sexual drive. The erotic object can easily be transformed or displaced. For example, an infant prematurely forced to give up the nipple as a sexual object, may substitute the thumb as an object of oral pleasure. So as for reading the example, so when we were still a baby, di ba ginapadedi ta? So, or breastfeeding ta sa atong mama or mother. So, as time goes on, because of some development factor and growth, gina-stop na ang breastfeeding ni mama. Or, sa Bisaya, palutaso na ang baby. So, wala man dyan forever. So, mas-stop na ang breastfeeding. So, as a substitute, ang usually nato makita no kay ang ilahan ng thumb ang ilahang ginadede, which is orally fixated. Sex can take many forms, including narcissism, love, sadism, and masochism. So, we will identify what is this term in the next slide. Narcissism. Infants are primarily self-centered, with their libido invested almost exclusively on their own ego. This condition, which is universal, is known as primary narcissism. So, as stated sa first paragraph, infants are primarily self-centered. So, why is it na ginatawag man nilang self-centered when baby pa man siya? It's because, di ba, ang mga babies, kung obserbahan nato, it requires full attention of the mother, especially kanang ginag-breastfeed, and then need siya full attention. Kaya syempre dili pa man makasulti ang baby kung asa, for example, naday sakit sa iyaha, dili man siya makaingon na masakit diri nga na. It's because baby pa man siya. So usually ma-recognize nato na naisakit ang baby or gigutom through sa iyahang crying. As the ego develops, children usually give up much of the primary narcissism and develop a greater interest into other people, and this pronounced as secondary narcissism. Narcissism is not universal, but moderate degree of self-love is common to nearly everyone. Grow up, no, is mawala na to sa ato ang atong mga primary narcissism na mga habits. It's because we are now learning how to interact with the people. Sadism is the need for sexual pleasure by inflicting pain or humiliation on another person, while masochism, like sadism, is a common need, but it becomes a perversion when eros becomes subservient to the destructive drive. Masochists experience sexual pleasure from suffering pain and humiliation inflicted either by themselves or others. Have almost the same thought, but what makes it different? Si sadism is what makes it different is sadism can humiliation an other person. It could be done to the other person, while si masochism is either inflicted by themselves or others. Dynamics of personality. This is to sum up driving forces behind behavior. Drives, eros, sex, libido, and thanatos, aggression. Sex, erogenous zone, genital, mouth, anus. Pleasure is not limited to genital satisfaction. Forms, narcissism, love, sadism, masochism, primary narcissism, and secondary narcissism. The next one is aggression. Aggression is a form of behavior directed towards the goal of harming or injuring or inflicting damage upon other individual who is motivated to avoid it. It intends to increase social dominance. People can avoid such treatment or may fight back, partially as a result of his unhappy experience during World War I, and partially as a consequence of the death of his beloved daughter, Sophie, Freud wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a book that elevated aggression to the level of sexual drive. And the final aim of the aggressive drive is self-destruction, aggressiveness of behavior. It is only ego that can produce or feel anxiety when our reality or our external world fails to achieve or commit the ideal in the reality. So one of the kind of anxiety, neurotic anxiety, moral anxiety, and realistic anxiety. So what is neurotic anxiety? It is defined as apprehension about an unknown danger. The feeling itself exists in the ego, but it originates from id impulses. People may experience neurotic anxiety in the presence of a teacher, employer, or some other authority figure because they previously experienced unconscious feelings of distraction against one or both parents. So during childhood, these feelings of hostility are these feelings of hostility are often accompanied by fear of punishment, and this fear becomes generalized into unconscious neurotic anxiety. So, kumbaga ba, yung mga pangamba natin, it's because baka naunsay mahitabo. Moral anxiety stems from the conflict between the ego and the superego. After children establish a superego, usually by the age of 5 or 6, they may experience anxiety as an outgrowth of the conflict between realistic needs and the dictates of their superego. Dito it's about the fight between your realistic needs and your superego or the moral and values principle. Like another example also, wala ka ka-study. And then, mag-exam na mo pagka ugma. So, what you did is, nag-cheat ka. Yes, perfect ka sa exam, though, nahiga po'y guilt within yourself na nakakuha lang kag score na taas. It's because nag-cheat man ka. So for example, would result from sexual temptations if a child believes that yielding to the temptation would be morally wrong. It may also result from the failure to behave consistently with what they regard as morally right. For example, failing to care for aging parents. So in realistic anxiety is closely related to fear. It is defined as unpleasant, non-specific feeling involving a possible danger. For example, we may experience realistic anxiety while driving in heavy, fast-moving traffic in an unfamiliar city, a situation fraught with real, objective danger. However, realistic anxiety is different from fear in that it does not involve a specific fearful object. So this is a form of natural occurring situation of anxiety na naga-exist sa atong real world. We would experience fear, for example, if our motor vehicle suddenly began sliding out of control on an icy highway. So, diba, kung inga na ang situation is makurat-kuratan jud ta. Hala, maunsa ka because mag-worried ka unsay consequences sa events. So, we are down to common defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are Freudian processes that operate at unconscious levels, and that use of self-deception or untrue explanation to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by anxiety. Although defense mechanisms are normal and universally used, when carried to an extreme, they lead to compulsive, repetitive, and neurotic behavior. Because we must expend psychic energy to establish and maintain defense mechanisms, the more defensive we are, the less psychic energy we have left to satisfy the id. Ano ba yung nagkakos? Bakit may defense mechanism? So, in the ego, if we fail to do some demands in the ego, so there is the tendency na maka-experience tag anxiety. And from that anxiety, we created this defense mechanism in order for us to reduce the feeling or the unpleasant feeling of anxiety. It's because we do not want to crush our ego from experiencing anxiety. So, kumbaga, through defense mechanism is we aim to unconsciously other definition of defense mechanism is ways to behave or think to protect or defend ourselves from anxieties, how we distance ourselves from a full awareness of unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So, different types of defense mechanism: repression, reaction formation, displacement, fixation, regression, projection, introjection, and sublimation.